Hello there. Welcome to Trinity Place. My name is Cameron Miller, and we're here, day of Pentecost in Genesis in Geneva, New York. And I'm actually gonna preach a sermon on two readings I haven't read in this worship video, one of which we read here as we were gathered in person. Acts, the book of Acts, chapter 2, verses 1 through 21, and Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Genesis 11, 1 through 9. So I'm going to oddly kind of preach on two stories that we didn't read out loud. But I think that's okay, because I think that you probably know these stories. We'll see. If you don't, look them up. They're often used in literature throughout beyond the Bible. So we know that archaeology is not an exact science. For example, the estimates on the population of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus can range from 20,000 to 250,000. The middling view from many is that it hovered around 75,000. And there were 3 festivals each year that male pilgrims were obliged to attend at the temple in Jerusalem. Passover, of course, Sukkot, or Feast of Tabernacles, and Shavuot, Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost. Now, these three festivals, the numbers of people in the ancient hilltop city would have blossomed. And today, on the Christian calendar, is the day of Pentecost that marks the memorial of that cinematic story from the book of Acts, when a handful of people who still believed that the dead Jesus had been the Messiah, or still was the Messiah, started speaking in every language represented in that part of the world. And tongues of fire were said to have alighted on their heads, and a mighty, even violent wind blew the sound of their yammering across the crowded city. We do not know for certain where this cadre of women and men had gathered, but I vote for the theory that they were somewhere in the lower city, which was the southern quadrant on a downhill slide where poor people lived. And I see them nudged together somewhere near the southern stairs entrance up into the temple, right near the mikveh, or the ritual baths where people cleansed themselves before entering the temple. It was undoubtedly grimy, dry, stinking, crowded, hot, and unpleasant, at least from the point of view of people who live in the spacious and pastoral cool of the Finger Lakes like we do here. But like I said, archaeology is not an exact science, and that makes biblical theology or interpretation not a science at all. But that's okay, because what we have in the book of Genesis and in the book of Acts, and everywhere in between, as a matter of fact, is story. Story. Story, in the sense that I am using this word, is full of truth, whether or not there is a single fact found within it. Truth and fact, of course, have little to do with one another, although on occasion they do both rest upon the same event at the same moment and generate a shared artifact. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to compare these two stories from the two bookends of the Bible and point to a truth or two held within those stories. Now, you can speculate for yourself whether they represent any facts, but I, for one, could care less if they are factual. First, the Tower of Babel story, which is an awesome, odd, and revealing story, I think. It's also the left bookend to the Christian Pentecost story. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the Pentecost story from Acts was first told with the Tower of Babel story from Genesis in mind. And that's because it was told by Jewish followers of the dead Messiah to explain where they came from. That's my theory. But like I said, I'm talking here story, not facts. In that book of Genesis story, that we read today, we read here, and I invite you to read too, it's about Babel. God sundered humankind by causing us to have different languages so that we could no longer communicate with one another. And now, it wasn't exactly a punishment. We like our different languages. But rather, it was a tactical maneuver by God. It was a response to our rascally capacity for engineering and technology and our voracious appetite for more. As it says in the Tower of Babel story, we humans had succeeded in building a tower high into the sky. God recoiled at this human encroachment upon the divine habitat. Now remember, we had been thrown out of the garden because we were an unruly bunch, right from the very beginning. So here we were again, building a stepladder back up there. Now, Babel is a story that also shows a pre-literate origin well before monotheism was in place, since the story hosts a conversation between the gods about what to do in response to this human vermin. Well, it was a clever response, a godlike response. The gods decided to divide us by inflicting us with a variety of languages so that it would be difficult for us to collaborate. And it worked. And right there is the counter story to the Christian Pentecost story. The book of Acts makes an intentional contrast with Babel. Where God had once separated us with language, God now unifies us with a spirit that enabled us to understand without shared language, and so overcome any human division. The punchline to the Pentecost story, if we were hearing it steeped in the stories of ancient Israel, would be that God had made all those people speaking in different languages suddenly understand each other. Think about what a miracle that actually would be if suddenly we could understand each other. It's a heck of a punchline. And it's a reversal on God's part that suggests that suddenly God decided to trust us. I know, that's a big question mark. What we need to realize is both of these are foundational stories. Babel and Pentecost. Genesis and the book of Acts. Genesis is a collection of stories that tells us how it all began. The exodus and kingdoms of David and Solomon had already happened by the time Genesis was put together. The Civil War had happened, and the eventual exile. The people called Israel started to collect and tell campfire stories about how it was before the time anyone remembered how it was. There were stories that explained difficult things to understand. Things like, what is a rainbow? Things like, why do we have to wear clothes? And how come if God loves us, we have to work so hard and suffer so much? Stories that explain things like, why can't we all just get along? And why do those other people not speak our language? The book of Acts does the same thing as Genesis did. The Gospels, the 4 Gospels, 5 or 6 Gospels, depending on how you count them, tell the story of Jesus and convey his teachings. But the book of Acts tells a story about how Christians became Christians and churches became churches. It tells stories to explain things too, like how things got started after Jesus was gone. Things like how Judas got replaced and how the numbers grew. Other things like splitting with the synagogue and baptism and transfers of power. The book of Acts is the New Testament book of Genesis. Lots of stories about how it all began. Are they factual? It doesn't matter. Because facts are not about what Acts is about. These two stories, Babel and Pentecost, tell us a truth we already know. Our inability to understand one another is deeply destructive. And likely it is the source of our inability to build the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And at the same time, these stories tell us the truth that sharing the love of God with one another in the same time and in the same space can create a bond between us that bridges our limited capacity to understand one another. It doesn't suddenly cure us, but it does give us a moment and a shared experience that forms a bond that enables us to forgive, to move on, to keep working together. Now, those aren't big secrets, anything deserving of a ta-da. Just two simple, humble, ordinary truths we know from our own experience. Our limited capacity to truly understand one another is a killer. The opportunity to share the love of God in the same time and within the same space offers us a reprieve in the form of a bonding agent. That's why we engage in spiritual community, for crying out loud. We know that something happens here together and over time that makes this different than other places and people. It's not a difference that we can describe with facts, but I'm sure we can tell a few stories about being part of a community like this that may convey its truth. I have a friend who just got back from Nigeria, where he visited a single church building. Get this, a single church building that accommodates 1 million people. He studies megachurches internationally. Can you even imagine one building holding that many people? No, I can't either. But I will tell you a truth that's even a fact. Any experience of the love of God between and among those 1 million people in Nigeria that bridges our limited capacity to understand one another is no different, no better than what happens here in this old wine bar among us or among whatever community you participate in. 3, 12, 25, 100, or 1 million. No better among many than a few. No better among a few than many. When it happens, when that thing that is a truth we know happens, whether in a story from the first century or among us today, it is the same love of God creating a bond that we can nurture so it will help us to bridge our lack of understanding. It won't take away the different languages, but it will empower us to touch and to be touched by one and the same Spirit. Now that is a truth embedded in the Babel and Pentecost stories. And by the way, it also happens to be a fact. Peace be to you. Have a blessed Pentecost.